All right, hope everyone can hear me. I have my camera set up a little bit differently here. We'll try to see how that pans out. Just so the windows that I share are bigger. I noticed in the last videos they were just a little bit too small. So hopefully this helps. I'll review afterwards and see what the take is. All right, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the article for today, which is called Evolving an Idionomic Approach to Processes of Change Towards a Unified, Personalized Science of Human Improvement. For those of us who are in clinical psychology, and for those of us who know about third wave psychotherapies, this article should be familiar. But if it's not, that's okay. We'll jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and switch my windows here. Okay, I think that's working. That looks pretty good. Yeah, hopefully the quality on that is sufficient. Okay, so getting into this article, this is a lot of jargon here to basically say that what the article is about is looking at individualized approaches and psychological processes of change. And the reason for this change is because we have seen from the past, not 100 years, but since the 1950s, 40s, 30s, we've really focused on a syndrome based approach for mental health, kind of like a medical model, so to speak, where we're trying to understand mental health diagnoses through symptom clusters, right? If we talk about major depressive disorder, we're looking for 5 of 9 criteria within the DSM-5 TR. And if those criteria are met, then, and to whoever checked in, feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. You certainly don't have to, it's up to you. And if you meet 5 of 9 of those criteria within the time frame given, more days than not for a 2-week span, then you're diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Now, that works as a blanket approach. And as we'll see in this article, there's a problem with what we call ergodicity. And this is the idea that values we get from studying a population generalize to the individual. That may work for certain things, especially physical processes, but it doesn't work as well for mental health and psychological processes. And one of the biggest reasons for this is because whenever you analyze enough variables within a given data set, especially something as variable as a person, even within their own life, someone is always in a constant state of change. They are always going to be changing to the point that you can't really generalize from a population. You can't even generalize within a single person in some cases, right? The changes that come along, those are severe enough to, not severe enough, but drastic enough to where what you measure in childhood isn't necessarily going to correlate to what you see in later life adulthood. So again, we have to be really careful here with how we're looking at data. It's good to get some individual variables, and as this article will show, it's also good to get some mechanistic factors. But if we rely too heavily on one side or the other, we are going to run into problems. Now, this is also something that perhaps we'll go into in another live stream. But this divide between, I suppose we could call this, there's a word for it. I'm blanking on it right now. It's not integrative psychiatry. I think it's molecular psychiatry. I will look that up later on and clarify. Actually, I'll just look it up right now. Okay, let's see. Oh, I just remembered. It's not molecular psychiatry. It's called precision psychiatry. And yeah, I know precision is a bit of a strange word to use there, but this is a different way of looking at mental health as opposed to what this article is talking about. So precision psychiatry, this is kind of doubling down on the reductionist approaches. This is saying, all right, we have been looking for almost the past 100 years for specific biological factors that explain mental illness. We haven't found them yet. We just need more time and we need more specifics. We need more technology. We need to look closer to find out what these biological factors are. Research domain criteria, or the RDoC, that's kind of the head initiative for this kind of approach. I haven't looked into where the status is in the past few years. Perhaps it's changed, but last I checked, they've been doubling down and they're now looking into genetic factors, individual genes. It's also getting at an individualized level, but it's focusing more on the biological aspects. Whereas this article is focusing more on psychological processes of change. And if you don't know what that means, that's totally okay. I will explain it in this article. The framework I want to set here is that both sides have recognized, I mean, we've gone through literal billions of dollars in funding and failed with finding specific exact causes for mental illness. You can see that through any variety of literature and data. It's all out there. So the issue is that because this syndrome based approach, right, looking at check boxes for symptoms, using that to explain mental disorders, thinking that what we see in the population matches the individual, because we see problems there, now we're seeing different approaches on how to proceed. The problem has been recognized, the solution is still in the works. This is going to be something that heads the next few decades at least of mental health progression and how we understand things and how we understand ourselves. Again, those two separations, one side I'm going to be talking about here, this is getting at psychological mechanisms of change and looking at key factors that we can find throughout literatures that explain the underlying psychological processes that explain the syndromes that you might see. Right? So if we're talking about major depressive disorder, what are the underlying psychological factors that might be involved? Lewinson's model is an example here. Avoidance, worsening depression. There's a lot of other different variables, psychological flexibility. We will go into those. And then on the other side, which I might do in a different article, this is more of the research domain criteria, just reiterating what I said several minutes ago. We're doubling down on the biological side, and we're going to see if we can find answers within individual genes or individual criteria. I remember working on a paper as an undergrad, a research paper, and we were looking into individualized genes and gene networks and what we call de novo mutations to see to what extent we could explain mental illness through understanding genes, de novo mutations, things of that nature. De novo is in like new, literal new types of mutations that you see in genetics that are implicated with mental disorders. Likely the answer, and this is obviously going a little more into the speculative end, but likely the answer is that both of these factors are two sides of the same underlying explanation. There's just multiple angles to mental health because, as we know, as we talked about before, self and other, ourselves, our environment, our mental health, the environment, these things are not separate, right? They are all tied in together. What you change in the environment can change your mental health. What you change in your mental health can change how the environment relates to you and how you relate with your environment. Okay, so let's get into the article. That's enough backstory here. Okay, so this article is pretty cool because what they did was they analyzed 55,000 studies, just about, and they were looking for core processes of psychological change. And they were looking through different types of mediational studies. There's other section, but most of 1,000 studies over, I forget the exact year, but several decades worth of data. And they tried to find out what are the core factors at play here? What exactly is working that's leading to these beneficial changes we see in psychotherapies? Could it be the case that, I mean, I'll spoil this right now. The answer is yes, but could it be the case that there are underlying factors that lead to change and benefit in mental health that are present regardless of the therapeutic approach that is assigned? Okay, so if People have heard of the dodo bird verdict. It's quite an old verdict at this point, but essentially the idea, let me see if I can pull it up here. Probably not worth pulling up, but yeah, basically the dodo bird verdict says that psychotherapies, they all work because there's common factors that lead to changes, and these common factors are present in all the different psychotherapies. True, right? Common factors are there. We know therapeutic alliance is the most important factor that leads to benefits or changes in mental health, but we also know that specific therapies do, in fact, affect different specific areas of psychological functioning in a non-equal fashion. Dialectical behavior therapy, for example, is going to be very good at targeting emotion regulation. It's going to be very good at treating borderline personality disorder, among other ones, whereas other types of therapies, those might be better for different disorders, different clusters, different categories. So this is also another thing where I'll save that for later. Actually, we'll go into it a little bit later in terms of integrative and eclectic approaches. Okay, so yeah, we should we should probably get into the article here. All right, so as they start off here, nearly 20 years ago, Hayes argued that cognitive behavioral therapy entered a third wave of development. For those of you who don't know, the third wave of development, it's reflecting changes that we've seen in cognitive behavioral therapy. And if you don't know what cognitive behavioral therapy is, most people probably have heard of it before. It's kind of the mainstream set of therapies, so to speak, but it's therapy that is focused on your cognitive or your cognitions, how you think. It's also focused on your behavioral, your behaviors, or how you act. Addressing both of those factors, we can make lots of changes in psychotherapy, and those can lead to improvements. Now, if I remember correctly, the first wave is focused heavily on behaviorism, looking directly into the behaviors. The second wave is looking more into the cognitive or the thoughts. And then the third wave is looking the most into context. Okay, so now we're, instead of directly targeting thoughts or directly targeting behaviors, you might see in what is it, REBT, radical emotive behavior therapy. Let me double check that one. Rational emotive behavior therapy. I thought I got that wrong. In that type of therapy, you might see something that's more of a direct, I don't want to say attack, but it kind of seems like it, kind of a more direct attack on different thoughts. Or, for anyone who's done therapy for any amount of time, they'll know about those cognitive restructuring forms, which I would say are a little dated at this point, but they certainly can still have efficacy in the right situation and right time. Those kinds of things, we're trying to restructure the thoughts themselves, change the thoughts, and use that to find improvement in mental health. The third wave is now looking at, all right, sure, we can work on the thoughts, that's fine, but perhaps it's more important to understand how somebody relates to their thoughts, right? If you have a negative thought, I'm always going to be depressed. Do you need to change that thought, or do you need to change your relationship to that thought? Now, this is a really interesting approach because perhaps there's a degree of diffusion that's needed, right? This is just a thought, it's just something that came up. Perhaps it came up because of the context of the situation I'm in. I'm hungry right now, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling tired, and this is how my mind's telling me those cues. It doesn't actually mean that I want to, or I'm going to be depressed for the rest of my life. It's just a negative cue that's coming from my mind, and whatever biological circuits and systems are involved, and that is what is causing me to think that, as opposed to buying into that thought at face value. That's getting more at the context here. So that's the third wave type of CBT, and there's lots of different therapies involved. Acceptance and commitment therapy, I've talked about that a little bit. Dialectical behavior therapy, MBCT, MCT, FAP, behavioral activation, and then compassion focused therapy. There's so many others. Those are just some of the well-known ones. So the third wave CBT, as it says here correctly, it didn't tear down what was already present. We're continually building on second wave, first wave CBT, even psychodynamics going all the way back. We're not just throwing things in the trash can and starting from scratch. We're constantly evolving and graduating our styles of therapy. All right, so what I wanted to talk about a little bit earlier, now we're starting to look into advancements in our systems of psychotherapy as a whole. Okay, so now there's this introduction of process-based therapy, which this is more of a new advancement in the field, but I think it's certainly a useful one. And process-based therapy is getting at what this article is about, right? If we know the core psychological processes that lead to change, if we know those mechanisms, why not take those mechanisms and select them for certain individuals, certain characteristics, certain contexts, certain time periods, and apply those based on our clinical judgment and skill as a therapist, and use that to dictate how therapy works. If we're just going by, okay, we're going to do ACT for this therapy, we're going to do DBT for this therapy, then you're already limiting yourself to a certain system of thought. And this is what I was going to talk about a little bit earlier. Any therapist who's been around the block, at least for a little bit, a few years, depends on your level of competence, you will see that pretty much all of them are integrative or eclectic in their approach. Ideally, they're integrative because eclectic is just, I don't want to bash on it too much, but it's kind of going by the feel of what you think works as a therapist, whereas integrative is more so getting into the evidence for what works. Okay, so if you're, for example, looking at acceptance and commitment therapy, you might pull a couple things from dialectical behavior therapy, you might pull a couple things from a different type of therapy and put those together because you might look at research publications and you see that works. That's pretty much what any informed therapist is going to end up with anyways. They're going to find that there's no single therapy that works for everything, even though we're marketing these therapies as transdiagnostic, as, excuse me, as therapies that can be standalone, so to speak. We take what we understand and we look at the underlying mechanisms, and then we analyze many different avenues of information about the client in terms of their thoughts, their behaviors, their actions. It's really a complicated process. It seems simple to carry out therapy at face value, but it's really not. It's extremely difficult to get into good, effective therapy. It's very, very difficult to consider all these variables in a meaningful fashion, and you have to get it right. And if you get it right, you have to provide information in a way that the client is going to take and actually use. So lots of skills involved there. But anyways, that's what process-based therapy is getting at. It's kind of like a, I don't want to say a market, but a research capitalization on how clinicians already behave, at least most of the ones I've known, and myself included. That's what I've turned to. I've found that there's no single therapy that works the best for anyone or anything. We should understand all the therapies, all the different mechanisms of change, and use that, right? You're not going to meet a physician who only prescribes SSRIs. Well, you won't meet a good physician who only prescribes SSRIs. They are going to prescribe based on the classes of medication, based on their knowledge, based on what they know, based on the context of the situation. That's what a good physician will do. There's no medication that you're totally going to rule out, right? Even TCAs, those are old medications and they're really messy in terms of their psychopharmacological profile. However, there are select situations where you still might want to consider using them. Same case with therapy here. Why are we not doing the same? Why are we just sticking to different therapies and or singular therapies or singular approaches? I kind of cringe when I meet a therapist who says they've only been doing one therapy their whole life. I mean, one, that's probably not the case because they've probably learned to adapt in an integrative approach. And two, let me go ahead and, I'll say that doesn't show anyways. And two, if they have stuck to a single therapy for the entire time, I'm really concerned for what they might have missed, because even within a single therapy, you're going to see advances in that therapy every single year. You have to keep up with the literature. Okay, so this is where they correctly summarize third wave changes in psychotherapy, right? The first one we've already talked about, context over content. This is crucial. And I think it's a great change in psychotherapy because when we look at the context, I've already talked about this for 10, 15 minutes. I won't go into it anymore. When we look at the context, it's much more rich in terms of what we're doing. Content is a more rigid, narrowed focus. Now, of course, content is good to get into in certain situations, but we know that context cannot be separated from content. These are two interdependent things. We have to take them both into account. So I think it's great that we're doing this. Yeah, addressing more complex aspects of the human condition. Now, it's a bit of a stretch here. I'll come to that in just a second here, but yes, we are actively in clinical psychology working on making our therapies work across different domains of psychological functioning. I went over the mind last time. Therapies have really been heavily biased towards addressing the mind, but we know that there's much more to a person's functioning, psychological functioning, than just what is said, or I'm sorry, in terms of, oh, geez, excuse me there. Okay. We know there's much more to a person over what their mind is, right? There's much more involved here. And whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions if you want. Totally up to you. Looking at dimensions of consciousness, right? There's a mention here about Kundalini yoga. I haven't seen that integrated super effectively into psychotherapies, but there are attempts out there. There's just such a difference in approach. And in my main videos, I talk about that a little bit more, but Eastern and Western approaches are totally different in terms of what they're doing. Eastern approaches, you're going to see more of a spiritual basis, more of a way of life, more of a holistic and complete way of causing psychological change through totally reintegrating your life as a whole. Whereas Western psychotherapies are more on that problem solving side. Here's the problem, here's the fix. It's a little bit more of a narrow focus for the Western psychotherapy side. But that, of course, is changing, and that's the heart of what they're getting at here. We're starting to get more holistic in terms of what we're addressing. ACT, for example, is commonly marketed as something that not only should be a way of life, but also should be something that the therapist practices as well, not just the client. Therapists should really practice what they preach too. There's a mention here for psychedelic therapy, or more accurately, PAP, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I will probably talk about this in a different set of videos. I think it's very useful and very important as long as we're ethically, carefully, and correctly engaging in practice. There's kind of a bit of an exaggeration right now in terms of what we should expect. And I think part of that is because a lot of these psychedelic therapies, psychedelic approaches, they're finally returning after being banished for decades and decades because of a lot of the movements back in the 20th century, late 20th century. So I'll save that for later. And then, yeah, different other kinds of therapies here. So it's great, right? We're looking at a lot of different approaches. We're not being super narrow. I think that's perfect. Okay, this one I just mentioned earlier, so I won't go into it. Processes should apply to the clinician, not just the client. I know it doesn't feel like this when you're the client or the or the patient. They just kind of expect that they're going to some, I don't know what it feels like from the client side, but comments I've gotten from clients, it just feels like they're going to someone who's like neutral and someone who just like is in a magical box. Like, this is the therapy box, this is the therapy guy, and I just come here and I expect my problems to improve and then I leave and so on. They don't really think of the clinician too as a individual person. Now, that's not everybody. I've met some clients who are certainly like that, but vast majority, yeah, you don't really think of it that way. Even when you go and see your physician or your doctor, you are just going with a problem and you're so focused on your problem and your solution, you don't think about your clinician in the same kind of way, that this is also a regular person who has problems and issues and so on. So yes, processes should apply to the clinician, not just the client, because they're both human beings. Absolutely. Okay. Oh, is it scrolling differently on the window? No, that looks great. Okay. Yes, we've talked about this as well. Whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions if you want to. It's totally up to you. Yeah, building on existing strands of CBT. So this is something that we talked about with the second and first waves for psychotherapy. Okay. When we are building on those, we're not just discarding behavior, we're not just discarding cognition. Now we're taking a deeper look at behavior and cognition and seeing context, environment, spanning outwards beyond just the mind, beyond just what we do. Definitely agree with that. Okay. So next up, the article goes into an overview of ACT. I've already kind of done this before, at least in terms of the psychological flexibility, which is not exactly ACT, but it's the model that ACT is based off of, as well as relational frame theory. So I'll just give a basic overview here to help familiarize anyone who doesn't know ACT super well. Now, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, the core process of change we are looking at is psychological flexibility. We want to improve this in a way that is not just about improving psychological flexibility, but it's about improving psychological flexibility in such a way that a person can live life in a way that's most meaningful for themselves. That I think is a great aspiration for therapy. Totally agree with it. I think it's awesome. ACT has been around for several decades now. Stephen C. Hayes, if you haven't heard of him, he's one of the top psychologists, especially for acceptance and commitment therapy. His work on relational frame theory is the foundation for acceptance and commitment therapy. If you want to know more, you can certainly look into his work. I think he's over 700 publications now, so he's been a busy guy. And ACT is something that has really evolved the past few decades in a good way, I would say, especially in terms of randomized clinical trials showing that acceptance and commitment therapy works across a variety of diagnoses. It's not something specific to a certain category. It can help with just about any different problem. So these paragraphs are just about acceptance and commitment therapy, how it's developed over the past few decades, and in a lot of ways, how it has replaced many of the different psychotherapies that we used to rely on heavily. I won't go into that. ACT is one of the forefront psychotherapies now, which is good. Okay. Yeah, this was one of the big changes that came about. Still some controversy in behavior analysis. I think I'll just stay out of that one for this video. Perhaps another time we can go into it. Functional contextualism. This is just a really fancy way of saying we're looking at the context and the function within a specific environment, within a specific setting. The take that we've been talking about so far in many different ways. Okay. Yeah, a lot of different paragraphs on the background of ACT, relational frame theory, contextual sciences. We don't need to get into these because they're not the most important for what we're doing today. Yeah, still highly controversial here, as you can see in behavior analysis. But I will say a lot of those issues have been resolved, and the ones that haven't, at least they are sparking research in the right directions. That is perhaps what is most important in research. It's not necessarily about getting the correct answer. It's about sparking research and creating advancements that are useful and helpful. All right, a lot more on ACT here. Yeah, big surprise. One of the authors is the first author, Stephen C. Hayes. So you can expect just about every article that comes from him. He's talking about ACT, process-based therapy. He's pushing his own approaches here, which is completely fine because they are good approaches, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Let's get on to some other things here. Yeah, let's just skip over all those, not super important. Okay, psychological flexibility model. You can check my first live stream if you want a little bit more of an overview on that. Here they're talking about the open, aware, actively engaged portions. So if you take that hexaflex, you know what? Let me just pull it up here. I'll show you. It helps summarize the psychological flexibility model a little bit more. I will just switch screens here and oh, I almost clicked on end stream. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So hopefully you can see this here on the right. Open is the right two, well, I guess the left two. Aware is the middle two, engage is the right two. So I will just return back and I'll explain what all of these mean, just to give you a quick visual as well. Okay. So open is about acceptance and diffusion. Okay, so being able to remain open to experiences as they occur. The idea here is that we're trying to get away from what we call experiential avoidance, missing out on experience or important things in life because we're trying to avoid things that induce or cause suffering. This is certainly something that we don't want in life. So, being able to maintain an open approach even to difficult things, that is an important construct in psychological flexibility. Okay, that's the first pillar. Second pillar is awareness. So, awareness is a very, very complicated thing actually to talk about, but in a very basic sense, it begins with flexible, fluid, and voluntary attention to the present moment. I would simplify this further and say awareness is about how well your mechanisms of attention are trained, and awareness is a reflection of that. Present moment focus, dimensions of self, these are the two that are involved with awareness. In the approaches that I share, in terms of the psychology of awakening, attention and how our attention is trained, that is the most important aspect. If you don't have that, you're not going to find other things that are important in terms of finding freedom from psychological suffering. And then finally, engagement here. So engagement is getting at the behavioral portion of what you're doing, right? So when you're talking about your values, when you're talking about how you actually do things towards those values, that's where the engagement portion comes into play. This is the heart, so to speak, of acceptance and commitment therapy and psychological flexibility, because you can have all the other factors, but if you don't actually do anything, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and leave it at that. I don't want to get into a whole psychological flexibility talk again. So process-based therapy. Now we're starting to get into this portion. And this is where they start to discuss some of the other things about the research domain criteria initiative, basically the failure of mental health over the past decades. I wouldn't say it's a total failure because we have to communicate, we have to communicate clusters of behavior in some meaningful and useful fashion. And as we'll talk about later, this is one of the critiques for process-based approaches. We still haven't found an effective way to communicate those psychological processes of change. I'm not doubting, as far as my experience goes and my understanding of the literature, there are core psychological mechanisms of play, core psychological mechanisms of action at play. And you see those firsthand when you work with clients. But trying to explain those in a way that lay people can understand, it's very difficult. You need someone who's clinically oriented. Sorry, there's a bug right there. You need someone who's clinically oriented and clinically trained to understand those things. So if you go to a judge, for example, let's say you're doing a forensic evaluation and you talk about the psychological flexibility model, the judge is going to probably roll their eyes or just start doodling on their pad because they're going to have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Now, you could argue part of the reason that we understand the syndrome-based approaches is because it's been around longer. Okay, major depressive disorder has been around for decades, perhaps even longer than that as a DSM diagnosis. But the idea that we can just communicate in a term, right? If we say like a heart attack or um, yeah, if we just say a heart attack, then people generally know what you're talking about. There's a label that comes with it, which is helpful. The psychological processes of change aspect, that doesn't it's missing some key information. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? If you have, for example, let's say someone is deficient in emotion regulation. It's like, okay, yes, they're deficient in regulation. I get that. They have emotion problems. But how does that manifest as a behavior, right? We're starting to see some difficulties there. That could be a major depressive disorder. That could be a borderline personality disorder. That could be any variety of disorders. So having these generalized clusters of behavior explained as disorders, that's not totally useless. It's a helpful way to communicate information to others, especially those who are not in the mental health field. Now, there are problems, right? When we talk about mental health disorders as they are in the DSM-5 TR, there's underlying psychometric issues, validity issues, reliability issues, deep questions on what exactly a diagnosis is. When we take those problematic diagnoses, which just look into any diagnosis, look it up in literature, and you will see that there are problems with how these things are defined. When you see these problems, and then these problematic diagnoses are used for medications, like you'll see FDA approval lists for different diagnoses. There's like, I think there's only one medication for schizoaffective disorder, but then there's deeper questions about whether schizoaffective disorder is separate from major depressive disorder with psychosis, or whether it's schizoaffective disorder bipolar type, or whether it's a bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or whether it's some unspecified schizophrenia spectrum related disorder, or you can go on. There's so many overlapping potential diagnoses. The comorbidity issue is there. When you base individualized medications on these diagnoses, and these diagnoses are problematic to begin with, yeah, you're going to have some issues there, right? Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but basically what I'm trying to say here is that the RDoc initiative is doing its thing, and then this article is doing its thing as well in terms of psychological mechanisms of change. And then there's this whole super complicated, intimidating looking cube of EEMM, the extended evolutionarily meta model. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest proponent of this model. I think it's aspirational. It's nice that they're trying something different, and this is mainly a pull to, I don't want to say copy, but emulate what other fields are doing in terms of basing how we understand information off of evolution, right? Evolution's pretty well accepted and understood as an explanatory variable for change over time. And this is the attempt within process-based therapy to do the same. There's a lot of underlying problems about this model. It's aspirational. We'll just leave it at that. And it does organize information in a way that can be useful, but there's a lot of underlying theoretical foundations and core foundations that, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. So I won't talk too much about it. If you want to read more about it, you're welcome to. All right. Okay, yep, still going on about the EEMM and process-based therapies. I won't go into these much further. Okay, yeah, we can talk about this. This is also an important area. Okay, idionomic. This is just a fancy way of saying individualized. Up until recently, and this is still ongoing for the most part, we have been trying to understand people through population-based analyses. The main reason for this is because it's convenient and easy. I'll give you a good example that everyone can just about understand. When we talk about IQ, okay, your intelligence quotient, when we talk about your IQ, we are taking a certain set of constructs. Let's say we're looking at the WAIS 5, for example, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And we are taking underlying constructs. So we're talking about verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, processing speed, full scale IQ. There's a whole other bunch of substructures as well involved, but we're taking a number of constructs and we're theorizing that these are how we understand human intelligence. We take those constructs and then we create a different number of questions and tests. I'm just giving basics of test construction here. There's much more in terms of nuance to it. And then we give those tests to different people in different populations, right? We might give it to thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know about hundreds of thousands, but perhaps in some data sets, yes, it could be hundreds of thousands or more, especially with computerized information. And then we see how people score on these tests. And then we try to construct a dimension that we can measure, right? IQ. We're going to look at certain IQ scores where 100 is the average. We have a standard deviation. And then we have a population-based metric, right? We've given this to a population. Here's the metric. Here's the outcomes. And now if we give this, it does. And, oh, let me see. I've got an issue with connection. Okay, looks like it resolved itself. And when you have that, yes, you can come up with a good IQ metric, but it doesn't get at the individualized differences in intelligence. Is it really the case that the brain just has verbal comprehension abilities and then we are accurately measuring the verbal comprehension abilities? So when we give this test, it's completely measuring that dimension of functioning? Obviously, no, and everyone knows that, right? This is science. This is aspirational. This is getting at the best we can do based on theory and evidence. But it misses out on the individual aspects of intelligence. Now, all of a sudden, we're saying that, hey, this person has an IQ of 60, right? They have an intellectual disability. They have a problem. It's like, yeah, in IQ, they seem to be doing worse than the generalized population, but we haven't looked at the totality of the person's functioning, right? There might be other domains that this person is really, really good at. You can see that with, what's a good example? I think Kim Peek, he had an IQ. Let me look it up. If you don't know who Kim Peek was, he was considered an autistic savant. Oh, I seem to have lost. Let me look up his IQ. IQ of 87, so he was low average, and he was an autistic savant, but he had so many interesting special abilities. For example, he could just go and look at a book, and he could read both pages at the same time and memorize the vast, vast majority of what he read. You wouldn't catch that in an IQ test. Okay, so the point I'm making here is that measurement has its flaws, especially when we try to normalize from population down to individual. That's what it's saying here in all its fancy terms, ergodic and so on. If you understand that, you understand this part of the paper. Okay, so basically the call is for understanding people through their individualized factors, more so than their population-based factors. Now, ideally, we want to look at both together. You see this in medicine as well, right? We're looking at genetic testing, the genetic factors that show, okay, here's what you see in the population, but may or may not be the case for the individual. Most likely is if it's a certain type of biomarker. That's exactly what they are. They're just biomarkers. Similar approach here for psychotherapy. All right. So yeah, one of the things they did, which is the main reason I have pulled this paper, and I know I've taken I've taken about 44 minutes to get into it, so I do apologize for that. But hopefully this other information is useful as well to whoever listens to this. Okay, so 1985 to 2018, 55,000 studies. That's a lot of studies to look at, and we'll glance over the methodology because we're running out of time. But essentially what they did was they looked at different studies that involved three things here, okay? Statistically significant mediational analyses of processes of change. That's just a fancy way of saying what variables explain processes of change. You can think of it that way. Had to be in a randomized control trial of a therapeutic treatment intervention linked to a mental health related outcome. RCTs, randomized control trials, these are just gold standards for lab settings. 3, compare treatment to a no treatment or treatment as usual condition. So comparing the treatment to something else, not just making claims without having, so to speak, a control setting. Again, there's problems with control settings for ecological validity and whatnot. Okay, so they eventually got down to about 55,000 articles, and what they're looking for here are the core mechanisms that explain all the different therapies from 1985 to 2018 and how these mechanisms of change lead excuse me, how they lead to psychological improvement through therapies. Okay, so we'll go ahead and skip down to the review. I know there's a ton of other stuff here. There's different measures that they use, different metrics, and we're not doing a research class here. There's no point going into it. Okay, but I will briefly show you some of these metrics, right? We have the AAQ, the FFMQ. I'm trying to see if there's some ones that are readily recognized. Here's one, the hopelessness scale from Beck. And obviously my colleagues and friends who are in clinical sciences, they will recognize the vast majority of these, most likely. So lots of different questionnaires, inventories, screeners, things that are used here. Yeah, we can skip over these things. Okay, this is the most important part of the paper. To whoever jumped in, you jumped in at the perfect time because this is exactly what the entire paper is about. We have summarized everything from 19... Oh, they left, so I guess it wasn't that important. We have summarized everything from 1985 to 2018 here. Now, yes, you can criticize a lot of the different methodologies. You could criticize the fact that the number one variable here is psychological flexibility, other than mindfulness. And the guy who is responsible for psychological flexibility, at least for the most part, is Stephen C. Hayes, who's the first author. Yeah, you could scrutinize, criticize all those things. Let's just put those aside for now. Let's just assume that there is something of use here that we can take in terms of our understanding of clinical sciences and how psychotherapies work. Psychological flexibility other than mindfulness. This is number one, percentage of mediational findings. So again, mediation is like, let's say someone is having negative thoughts and they get an anxiety disorder from their negative thoughts. What is the factor that explains this relationship? Well, it might be rumination, right? It's the extent with which they are adhering to and sticking to those negative thoughts. Whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions if you'd like, totally up to you. The rumination might explain how they go from anxiety to having those difficult, have those difficult thoughts to an anxiety disorder. Okay, so that's the mediational findings. So psychological flexibility other than mindfulness, that explained over 20% of these articles. Mindfulness, and I should add this to 1985 to 2018, that also happens to be the time period where acceptance and commitment therapy and all its different theoretical foundations started to come into play. I think the first workshop was in the early 1980s. So that's something else to consider too. Mindfulness is number two, and then there's a whole other list here. I think this is a really important, not sure what to call this, an important graph here. We'll just call it a graph. This is an important graph to look at least consider different psychological mechanisms of action. If you're doing different types of psychotherapies, or if you're even a patient, you can look at these core factors, research them, understand them about yourself. You may even structure your treatment plan and orienting your goals towards addressing some of these core changes. Again, that's getting more at the process-based psychotherapy side. But anyways, yeah, psychological flexibility other than mindfulness. This is number one. And we talked about all those different factors, open, aware, engage, the 6 different components that are involved. Even with all the biases included, I would say there's a pretty good explanatory factor here. And one of the main reasons for that is because of the foundation of psychological flexibility in relational frame theory. That's a pretty nice theory. It's especially compared to what we have in other psychological theories. I'm not going to attack anyone here, but yeah, it's pretty robust compared to a lot of other psychological theories. It is really hard to find anything of cohesive and solid value because of how difficult it is to pinpoint aspects of the mind and psychological functioning. But yeah, that makes sense, right? We have not just psychological flexibility, but we have six different dimensions. Each of those dimensions have two levels. Each of those dimensions fall within they don't fall within relational frame theory, but they relate to it, at least most of the components. So it kind of makes sense because psychological flexibility to begin with is a culmination of many of these other components, anyways. So that's something to consider as well. Mindfulness is number two. And this is important because when I think of mindfulness, I'm thinking of attention, right? How your attention is oriented, how your attention is trained. Mindfulness here is almost 20%. And I would argue mindfulness is actually number one because psychological flexibility is cheating a little bit in the sense that it is taking all these other ones. You could fit all these other ones in some way, in one way or another, in the psychological flexibility model. Mindfulness, however, I would argue is number one because it's a little below 20% and it's heavily focused on your attention. And most importantly, it's focused on your relationship, the context with which you are aware of things, right? You can be aware of a thought without buying into it. You can be aware of a thought with buying into it. And no surprise here, mindfulness, borrowed is kind of a generous word, is borrowed from a lot of different Eastern philosophies. And we see that now, I will say science has done a pretty good job of giving the details and the rationale for why these things work, whereas Eastern side gives more of an intuitive, holistic, generalized understanding of why these things work. But anyways, yeah, mindfulness is way up there. And this is similar to what I found in my own research, my own publications. The mechanisms of attention and how we train them. We don't really know what attention is, which is kind of a strange thing to say. But we do know that attention is very closely implicated to the conscious states and contents of our experience. Thoughts are certainly in that category of contents of consciousness. I will make other videos about that. That's a whole other topic. Very, very, very complicated, to say the least. Now, some of the other top ones, right? Once we jump off of mindfulness and psychological flexibility, all of a sudden we're below 10%. We're getting pretty low here almost immediately. So that should tell you right here. I mean, just take this away. Mindfulness and psychological flexibility, these are the top approaches here that work for psychotherapies across the board, all the different types. Okay. Negative, unrealistic, dysfunctional thoughts. Again, you could put that within diffusion. You could put that within mindfulness. You could put that within present moment focus. You could put that within acceptance. So that fits, right? Anxiety, sensitivity, that fits. All these other ones fit. Now I'm not saying these are all useless, but they're kind of like taking apart the top two and then looking at the different layers. Like here's the receipt, psychological flexibility and mindfulness. Here's the itemized components on that receipt. That's basically what this is really saying. There's a lot of different things to consider here, a lot of different limitations. Again, every study is going to have its limitations, but there are some useful takeaways here. I just want to convey these two, the top two here, super, super important. Okay. And let me see if there's anything else I want to say. Brain structure, that I'll just leave that one alone. Therapeutic alliance is pretty low here. That's pretty interesting. I did say therapeutic alliance was most important as a common factor for what helps with psychotherapies, but it looks like in terms of a mediational finding, therapeutic alliance is a little different. And that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because the way this study is constructed and the way the research questions are asked, therapeutic alliance is not something that's at the top. Okay. All right. As you will notice, there are a lot of, I would say, overly fancy acronyms: group, iterative, multiple model estimation, gimme. We're taking psychological mechanisms of action, psychological mechanisms of change, and then we're trying to connect those to individualized factors, integrative approaches. That's basically what we're doing here for space therapy. This is just more of a formalized, fancy, nuanced, scientific, research oriented way of doing it. Okay. Here's an example: struggled to connect with the moment. Okay. Psychological inflexibility, the present moment focus, not being in the present moment. We could say that's the center component here, what we're looking at. What does it lead to? Anxiety. Okay. What does it lead to? No meaningful challenge, complying with what others wanted. My thinking got in the way, right? And then how do these arrows connect? So you're starting to construct an interrelated web here for areas you might approach in therapy that are based on the psychological core mechanisms of change. This is the way that we conceptualize in process-based therapy, more or less. There are some nuances, the EEMM, if you want to use that. Now, what's funny about process-based therapy is you can also take process-based approaches and use that in process-based therapy. So just pick out what you want. This is what therapists do for the most part, at least the good experienced ones I've met. They already do this by default. So in that sense, it's nice that we're formalizing these things, but people do it anyways. Whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions. I'm a psychologist. I'm going through some psychological literature here. Totally up to you. So process-based therapy, yes, it works, but ultimately, this is what clinicians have been doing all along with integrative approaches. But I don't want to bash process-based therapy here, right? It's good because when we put things into research and we formalize them into articles, that gives the basis for people to talk about these things. It gives the basis for people to better understand, explain, and scrutinize things. Whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes. I'm a psychologist. I'm going through process-based therapies. Okay, so in conclusion, and I'll jump back here to whoever jumped in if they want to see this, the mediational findings, the most important things about psychotherapy over the past 40 years or so, at least according to certain authors in a certain context and a certain situation, this is what we end up with. Mindfulness, psychological flexibility, these are arguably the two most important things. I would say mindfulness and mechanisms of attention, these are really things that we need to look into. Also, because attention involves dimensions of consciousness. Neuroscience, clinical psychology, psychiatry, psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, all of these different things are utilizing attention and consciousness more and more. These things will help us advance our field in psychotherapy. Whoever jumped in, feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes. Unless you have questions, I will answer anything that you have. I'm a psychologist going through various literatures here. So I think it's great. It's a sign of advancement, especially as we understand consciousness more and more, attention more and more, as we move beyond just cognition and behavior. There's much more to a person than cognition and behavior. You could sit right now and without having any thoughts, just being aware in the present moment, kind of like this. You're still functioning, right? Your consciousness is still going. There's still a whole lot of things evolved, even though we've shut down temporarily your cognitions. I mean, behaviorally, yes, you are technically doing something, but not actively doing something in the sense of what we're talking about here with goal-oriented behavior. You are just being. So in a sense, that also highlights where the field is heading to, right? We're starting to look at other dimensions of psychological functioning beyond the scope of what has been covered in this article. These mediational findings, 1985, I think it was, to 2018, these are good for the range and the scope that it was looking into, but we're going well beyond what's covered here. I think it's really nice, really promising, and really exciting for psychotherapies. It's just a great time to be here, being able to see past the traditional kind of sitting on the couch, just talking about your dreams, which I think is cool in its own way. We're talking about the contents of consciousness and how those are involved with your states of consciousness. And yeah, psychodynamics, psychoanalytic therapy, that's a whole other set of videos too. Lots of useful things there as well. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. I don't see anybody here. I think I've been scaring people as I invite them to ask questions. So maybe I will change up my approach. Hey, to whoever's there, is it scary if I ask you to ask me questions? Just trying to figure out how I can cater things. I guess I sort of just asked a question right there. But yeah, anyways, if the person there doesn't ask any questions, I'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Bottom line, psychotherapy is advancing. Yeah, they left, so maybe that's the exact problem. But yeah, bottom line, psychotherapies are advancing, lots of different things to understand. Here, I just want to emphasize that we have psychological processes of change. It goes well beyond just symptom clusters or singular thoughts or singular behaviors, much more complicated than we initially thought. Okay, I'll go ahead and finish things off there since nobody is here now and I don't see any questions. I don't think anyone asked any questions. So, yeah, see you next week.